Well, we've journeyed far. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the formation of religious thought in early evolving humans during their hunter-gatherer years, and we've looked at some of the evidence that supports the notion that they were religious, that they were the people who provided the foundation for religion in human society. And now we're going to turn to a related but distantly related question, which is, in human beings, such as ourselves, in modern form, having been bequeathed the legacy of the hunter-gatherers, part of which involves religion, how do those beliefs get formed in the human brain? And it's particularly germane because in the interim between the hunter-gatherer years, we've had this whole thing called civilization. And part of that process, historically, has been the inculcation of a competing set of values that are based on evidence. And so, as we continue our thoughts about human evolution and the selective pressures that led to it, we need to answer, or at least address in some way, the fact that our chimeric nature continues into the present, in that we have, as E.O. Wilson likes to put it, we were born believing one thing, and then, due to science, we found a second truth. And sometimes we have a little trouble reconciling those two very important formative values: belief in a supernatural God and the absence of evidence, and our reliance in the present day on modern science, which is evidence-based by nature. So we get into some really interesting questions about the nature of belief, the nature of how it's formed, how it's preserved, how it's changed in the face of contrary evidence. So we'll take this on in 4 parts. We'll have a few comments to make about the nature of Western society, then religion in Western society in the present day, how we have a basic definition of belief. What does it mean to have a belief? And lastly, how are those beliefs formed? And what is this thing called causality? And how is it related to the formation of identifiable beliefs? Well, you're going to find out as we have this discussion that there are all sorts of contradictory notions and competing values that reside in a single human brain, which one would think would lead to some sort of cognitive dissonance on pretty much a regular basis. But you'll also discover that humans just have some interesting ways of melding disparate worldviews in ways that make sense to us internally. It allows us to keep our internal harmony going, and yet, if viewed dispassionately, might lead to the conclusion that, wow, I don't know how they can believe that, which seems to be a fairly common preoccupation in the modern day. You know, we have our own internalized set of beliefs, which we think are palpably and demonstrably true, even in the absence of evidence. Then we have this general contempt for, or at least inability to understand, those who believe differently. And so H.L. Mencken put a nice spin on this when he said, believing passionately in the palpably not true is the chief occupation of mankind. And if that is in fact true, it maybe explains a lot. So what can we say about all of this, sort of by way of introduction? Well, we've already mentioned that religion is a complicated belief system that involves supernatural things. So let's ponder for a second what that means. Supernatural, beyond the natural, or beyond that which is demonstrable through some sort of evidentiary process. We have evidence to support. But our belief in the supernatural doesn't require necessarily that evidentiary basis. And that leads to the Mencken quote. So we know that if we believe in religion, we probably live apart from the world in which the God of our understanding, or gods, depending on your religion, live and have their home base and exert their influence. We know that many of us believe, many very, very intelligent people who have occupied the upper strata of our society and are therefore worthy of our admiration and perhaps emulation, we know that many of those people, including some of us, believe that the supernatural deity to which we subscribe has potentially the ability to oversee and intervene in human affairs in mechanisms or through mechanisms which absolutely defy modern physics. We often cede our own personal authority to those divine beings as well as our personal autonomy, and we may be willing to give much of ourselves in pursuit of a relationship with that supernatural being or beings, including the sacrifice of our own lives. We know, furthermore, that the belief system, which is alive and well today and practiced in very diverse ways across the globe by modern men, had its basis, as far as we can tell, in prehistoric time when group cohesion was absolutely a sine qua non, a thing essential for our very survival. These ideas and relationships were forged during a time when the laws of nature were virtually unknown, and ignorance of those laws and of the physical world increased the uncertainty and the angst that we felt. At the time, we lacked enough information to construct a narrative that was based on rational thinking, that was based on evidentiary thinking, and so it was perhaps easy to understand why people gravitated toward an explanation that made sense to them at the time, even if it doesn't bear up under the kind of scrutiny that modern science would exert today. And as far as we can tell, this kind of religious thought came to us because of our basic need to establish causality in the world, to understand why things happen and if they're going to be repeated and so forth. So that's the basis for our understanding. And we continued on as a species after the hunter-gatherer years. We entered the modern age after a bit of negotiation and exploration of different modes of understanding. But one particularly important pivotal moment in that understanding of human thought occurred during the period known as the Enlightenment, which spanned a couple of hundred years from the 700s to the 800s. And it was an interesting period of time because we kind of departed from the reigning text and emerged with a new confidence that man, acting on his own and through his own devices, would be able to understand all knowledge, and that all knowledge was unified in some coherent way. Knowledge from the arts to the humanities to the biological sciences to the physical sciences to mathematics. All of these things were combined into a coherent spectrum of knowledge in a way that understanding one of these fields unified and strengthened another. So it was a very powerful moment because human beings came to the view that ultimately mankind would be able to understand all of the underlying physical bases for all natural phenomena. And furthermore, it was believed that humans would be able to harness the power of science and technology and use it to fulfill human goals. So with this emerging understanding, it would seem not incongruent to think that as this played out, and if these goals, lofty as they were, came to fruition, that the need for religion, for appealing to a supernatural deity to control the forces of nature, would seem to diminish over time. Or that would be at least one potential outcome of this new understanding achieved during the Enlightenment. And so some thinkers, some philosophers, some sociologists envisioned a progression in which human thought moved from the era of mythology, in which we used stories to explain natural phenomena, sometimes with a moral twist or lesson, again illustrating the melding of very early scientific information with religious ideas. We moved from that era into an era of formal religion, in which particular deities were assigned responsibility for natural phenomena and also for regulating human behavior, both good and bad. And from that, according to these same thinkers, we entered the current era of science, in which human rationality and human effort, anchored in science and technology, replaced the gods, or at least kind of relegated their authority and influence to the back 40 acres. Or at least that was the thinking, that we were on this very well-defined trajectory in which the gods would occupy a smaller and smaller place in our understanding of the world. But if you look around you in the present age, you'd have to conclude that that has not happened. If we look at this in a very cursory way and just mine modern text or modern conversations for evidence of religious thought, you'll find things having to do with religion of various types in human culture of all kinds in the present day, and Western culture, our own, is certainly littered with them. Going back to one of the ancient Greeks, Plato in the Phaedo said, quote, "If death were released from everything, it would be a boon for the wicked." From John Locke, one of those Enlightenment thinkers, quote, "Those who deny the existence of the deity are not to be tolerated at all. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon or sanctity for an atheist. For the taking away of God, even if only in thought, dissolves all." Okay, so John Locke was an Enlightenment thinker, and he was on the forefront of advancing notions established in the Enlightenment, and yet he's clearly very tied to the existence of a supernatural deity, in this case, the Christian God. And if we look in current times, this is from a fairly recent poll, a Pew poll, if I'm not mistaken, in which the major religious traditions of United States adults were surveyed, and we note a bunch of interesting things. Most Americans profess some sort of religious affiliation, and in the United States, almost 80% say that they are Christians. And of course, there can be various kinds of Christians. Protestants or Catholics are the main two groups. But Mormonism, also a Christian religion. Jehovah's Witnesses, also a Christian religion. Orthodox persuasions from different cultural backgrounds, also Christian. So, in the United States, most adults who profess a religious faith will say that they are Christian. But there are others that are pretty well represented. We have 4.7% claiming to belong to a group other than Christianity, of which Judaism is a big one. But also we have some representations from Buddhists among American citizens. 0.6% are Muslim. A smaller number are Hindu. And then if we pass into the realm of other world religions, we have some representation among those faiths as well. Other faiths that are not, as we would say, mainstream include a fair number of Unitarians, some who claim to be New Age people belonging to New Age religions. We are at last including the Native Americans and their religions among our list. And then finally we get to the fairly large group, 16.1%, saying they are unaffiliated. And that would include those who identify as atheists. They don't believe in any God, 1.6% of the total. Agnostics, who are uncertain about the existence of God, amounting to 2.4%. And then nothing in particular. So they really have no thoughts about the nature of God and whether they should believe in one. And that amounts to 12.1% of the total. And then lastly, the perennial, I don't know. Could be anything. But the point is that we have a whole bunch of people, the majority of people in the United States, amounting to just under 85%, profess some sort of religious belief, in contrast to the unaffiliated group. And among those who do have a religious belief, the vast majority of them say that they are some sort of Christian. So, we might legitimately ask, why does religious belief remain so strong among Americans? And in recent years, we have seen that this is the case even when that religious belief directly contradicts science. So I am interested in your thoughts, because to me this seems like a very big thing. How can we maintain religious beliefs which is directly contradicted by the evidentiary basis produced by scientific endeavor? Apparently we don't have a problem with it, but it would seem to be the sort of collision of worldviews that might cause some internal contradictions to emerge. So, if we start to look at this more analytically and begin with a definition of religious belief, we'll find, first of all, that it's just a specific example of a more general idea. So I have taken this definition of belief from the shorter Oxford Dictionary. That is not necessarily the most authoritative source for this definition, nor is it the only one, but I think the Oxford Dictionary is wonderful, so I am happy to purloin their definition with attribution, of course. If you extract a definition or any other direct statement from any other published source, you must provide attribution, and as long as you do, you will be on more or less solid ground. So, according to the shorter Oxford Dictionary, what is a belief? Well, belief is the mental action, condition, or habit of trusting to or confiding in a person or thing. Secondary definition is trust, confidence, faith. The second full definition is, quote, mental assent or acceptance of a proposition, statement of fact as true on the grounds of authority or evidence. And finally, the mental condition involved in this assent. So, in considering the definition of belief from the shorter Oxford Dictionary that I just offered to you on the previous slide, please note that faith and reason they come from the same source. Also note that beliefs are not defined as facts, nor is evidence necessarily connected to those beliefs. And in fact, if we begin to now try to connect these ideas to explicit passages from divine texts, we find that the intensity of belief may be completely unconnected to evidence, and in the case of religion, the lack of evidence may be proof of faith. So here is a line from Hebrews 11:1, which is relevant to this point. Quote, "Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." So we learn from this that faith itself is substance. Faith itself is evidence. What an extraordinary statement, even if it is several thousand years old. So how do we come to believe something for which there is no evidence? No evidence in the physical world that we can prove or explore or probe or test via scientific means. Or it could be something for which the lack of evidence is viewed as an asset, such as the quote from Hebrews. And if you think about it, there is a certain logic to it, because we are, after all, talking about faith in a supernatural being. And so, is it not correct to say that if you are willing to believe this, in the absence of evidence or in contraindication to the available evidence, could we not say that your faith or one's faith is therefore that much stronger? The lack of evidence can be viewed as an asset. Now, we need to realize that human beings crave this thing called causality. We want to know the reason behind things, why things happen in the real world. And that phenomenon, the establishment of causal beliefs in the human mind, is something that human beings have really expanded as part of their behavioral repertoire and their basic understanding of how the world works. Animals, non-human mammals, have fairly few causal beliefs. They have some, as we will discover, but not nearly so many as modern humans do. And we also are told by psychologists that the inability to discern a causal explanation for events in the real world can lead to actual physical discomfort in humans so great as our need for understanding causes. Or as the philosopher David Hume said, causation is the cement of society. So how does causal thinking take root in human beings? Well, it actually begins in the earliest childhood that we can imagine. In fact, it begins the minute you're born. It begins with babies in the crib. It is something that is written into our genes, this need to develop a causal understanding of the world. But it is also modified by culture and by teaching or interaction with others. Like language acquisition, which is also going on during this period, it's learned effortlessly. It's part of that suite of skills that Lionel Tiger alluded to as being necessary during the early childhood years when humans are genetically programmed to learn massively in the early part of their life cycle. And as a result, anthropologists like Lionel Tiger consider it to be innate, consider it to be genetic in nature. Babies who have been studied in the quest to understand causality, babies learn causal connections through the gathering of sensory and motor information and the integration of these phenomena in their developing brains. And as I said, it starts from the moment of birth. So the first causal connection that a baby learns is, I feel hungry. Being hungry does not feel good, so I cry. And as a result of crying, I get fed. And that initial causal connection is reinforced many times per day as the very young child goes through this repertoire of I'm feeling hungry, I cry, and then I get fed. And he learns that if I have this feeling in my stomach and I cry, I will get relief from that feeling of hunger. That's a causal connection. And one of the first ones that we learn as brand new members of this planet. So this is one of the many reasons why it's absolutely imperative that teeny tiny babies have this sense of security, sense of my needs will be met. And this is very evident in this first establishment of a causal connection. It's also the case that if you look at a very young child, a baby, an infant, one of the things that you'll see is that little baby is doing some weird movements that don't appear to make a lot of sense. You'll see the arms and legs kicking and flailing to no particular and they're not really able to do much but lie on their back. They can't even roll over by themselves when they're first born. And so you might think that that's just random movement. Why are they doing that? But it turns out it's not just random, uncontrolled movement. It has that appearance, and in a sense it is. But what happens when the baby does this is the baby is encountering and counteracting forces that restrict the movement of the limbs. And as a result, the baby learns really important information about this is me, this is not me, and other really fundamental things that the baby's going to need to know in his life going forward. So that apparently random flailing of arms and legs is actually an important physical experiment undertaken by the baby. The baby needs to know what part of the world is his or her body and what part is other stuff, and then he or she will learn how to interact with that other stuff. Also, the flailing leads to, eventually, after a couple of months, the ability to coordinate one's arms and one's hands with one's vision. And when that happens, the baby can reach out and grab something that he or she wants. And that's a really important developmental skill, which is high on the list of things that pediatricians monitor in the first year of life to make sure that the baby is acquiring this causal information with which he or she will be able to navigate the physical world on his own once it's fully established. So another lesson that the babies are learning as they do this apparently random motion is that the babies begin to understand that movement by them can cause other things to move. For instance, if there's a mobile suspended above the baby's crib, it could be a bunch of animals dancing around when the baby moves, or hearts that dance around when the baby moves. The baby begins to understand because he's doing little experiments every day as he kicks his arms and legs and begins to make a connection between the fact that when he kicks his arms and legs, the little toys above him on the mobile begin to move, which is a really interesting thing because the baby learns that he or she has power in his own limbs and he can exercise that power to do something, to make something else not connected to the baby move in the environment. So babies turn out to be pretty good physics professors. And early on, they perceive physical events occurring according to three basic principles. They begin to understand that moving objects maintain a connectedness and cohesion. They don't break up or disappear. They also begin to understand that when they move continuously, these things not only don't disappear and reappear, they may go away, but they don't evaporate into thin air. So they can be discovered or rediscovered by looking around and figuring out where the item that apparently disappeared has gone. They also learn that items move together or interact, but only when touched by another item. And these physical principles are the part of the exploration of little babies in their very early days and weeks. And as they grow in their visual acuity, they will begin to understand all of this. They will begin to understand their part in making these things happen, and they will internalize all of this information as part of their emerging view of how the world works. By 6 months of age, babies understand that some objects have what we would call a renewable source of energy. They begin to understand that some objects can transfer energy. So, for instance, if a moving ball collides with a stationary ball, the stationary ball will subsequently move, and babies begin to understand that in case any of them want to become a pool player later in life. They begin to understand the concept of force, which can, upon impact, cause that second object to move. And in fact, babies, young babies, 6 months or younger, can even estimate how far the impacted object will move after the collision takes place. Babies begin to understand gravity. Between 6 months and 12 months, if you drop a ball in front of a baby, the baby will immediately shift its gaze to the ground. It expects the ball to fall down. It does not expect the ball to be suspended in midair or go up. Furthermore, babies expect a car with wheels to roll down a ramp and to increase its speed as it goes. It does not expect it to roll up a ramp backwards in the absence of some sort of force acquired from another object. So all of these things are being cemented in the baby's mind as natural and the way things are. And this is incredibly important because it forms the basis for his intellectual development later on. Another really important phenomenon that the baby will learn during this first year is the notion of object permanence. If you look at a very young child, let's say weeks or a few months old, and you play the game that we used to call "Where's the blanket?" or "Where's the ball?" So you show the baby a ball, and maybe you let the baby play with the ball, and then you take the ball back and you hide it behind your back. A really young child will not look for that ball, even if he wants it. The ball disappears, and as far as the very young infant is concerned, that means the ball's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. But by 6 months, a baby will look behind somebody's back if the object held in the hand disappears. By 12 months, babies start to get really stealthy. They know if they pull a cloth off of something, they might find the hidden object. And so they learn to do that. By 18 months, babies have enough dexterity and enough hand-eye coordination that they can use a stick to remotely push or pull a cloth off of that ball if the baby really wants the ball. So you can see in this sequence of events how the baby's understanding of the physical world has changed and how those beliefs have changed in a very short period of time. And to a certain extent, this is facilitated by the fact that babies see nature as goal-directed. And this is all tied up in our human need to explain things. We don't like things we cannot explain. It's simply fundamental to being human, and it's reinforced very early on by this mechanism that we have for discovering causal effects in the real world. We do little experiments like the ones we've just been discussing. This is a key driver in human development. Many of the things we just discussed are considered developmental milestones for young children. They need to meet these pretty much in sequence and on time if they're going to be normal adults. And because humans, and children particularly, are consumed with learning causality for their first 3 years, they undertake this inevitably. If they don't have adults to kind of show them the ropes and enrich their learning, they may learn it at a slower rate, but they're all about learning causal connections for the first 3 years, just as they are acquiring language, and the two kind of meet at various important junctures. They're able to explain or to ask, well, why did that happen? Or how did that happen? And a lot of this is manifest in the reality that particularly action verbs are something that young children will use to ask about the world or describe the world as their ability in their native tongue increases. But what happens after these principles have been established and have become the bedrock of the child's imagination and explanation for how the world works? What happens when those principles are apparently violated? If the child is presented with an unexpected result based on his causal connections that have been internalized, if something happens in the physical world that according to his view of causality should not happen, that child will very often explain that unexpected phenomenon as, quote, magic. And, remarkably, they will bend their explanation of how and why that happened to maintain consistency with their internalized belief. Another way of saying that is that we normalize the world to our beliefs rather than changing or adjusting our beliefs once they have taken root. This is a really important point. And this is your study guide for forming beliefs. We'll go on to talk about what happens in more detail when unexpected physical phenomena happen in the real world and it conflicts with the internalized belief structure.